Although this American edition of The Clear Light of Day was published first in 2007 by David C. Cook, there was a previous English edition, and I was actually writing the book in 2002 going into 2003. And the section that I'm going to read to you today, in part 3 of our instalments that takes us up to the end of the first chapter in the book, made me realise how things have changed in the years since I wrote it. There's mention about Esme's diary, and of course in those days a diary was not, as mine would be now, stored electronically in the computer or in the phone. And also there's mention of her answering the phone, and it assumes that what she's doing is picking up a receiver and holding it to her ear, not the whole phone like we have nowadays. And it just made me think, gosh, it seems like hardly any time at all since I was writing that book, and yet how things have moved on. Anyway, here we are, the next section of The Clear Light of Day. Esme turned on her computer and created a new file, set up the page margins and font size, and centred a heading: Sermon Notes for Portland Street, 10:30, September 6th. She pressed the return key and centred a subheading: 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. And she gazed at the empty screen, ate her biscuit, sipped her coffee, gazed at the empty screen, played a game of solitaire, and returned to the file she had begun. The 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Ordinary time. Esme thought about all the things that happen to ordinary people in their lives in ordinary time. A baby being born to a girl of 17 in a precarious partnership, living on welfare benefit and housed in a basement flat. A woman of 48 opening a doctor's letter telling her the ominous results of her smear test. A teenager who desperately wants to be a veterinarian, waiting for the results of his university application. A 5-year-old clutching his mother's hand as they walk together through the infant school gates at the start of the autumn term, trying to find the courage for separation. A housewife, married 26 years, looking wistfully across the street at young lovers locked in passionate embrace, thinking of the passing of the years, and so much that slips away almost unnoticed. A young man who has tried and tried to find employment, wondering about joining the army. Ordinary time is the place where people are born and die. It is full of hopes and regrets, and scored over and over with moments of deep emotion. And ordinary means also that which is ordained, the paths that cross, the eyes that meet, the decisions made and bargains struck that shape the future. Esme thought of how, as an 8-year-old child, during the school holidays, she tagged along with her mother, going to fulfil her turn on the church cleaning rota, while mother rubbed the fragrant lavender wax polish onto the pews with a stiff, waxy putting-on rag, and then buffed them vigorously to a beautiful deep shine with a clean duster. Esme wandered about the church, touching the cool stone and squinting through the grating set in the floor, exploring the choir stalls and eventually, greatly daring, climbing the steps into the pulpit like a tree house just right for a child. She stroked the faded velvet cloth on the sloping pulpit desk, peered over the edge at the rows of pews below, and wondered what it would be like to be the minister, standing here preaching the Sunday sermon. Esme wondered if St. Raphael's had done something to reach that child buried under the passing years. An ordinary child, in ordinary time, growing into an ordinary woman, with all the ordinary griefs and doubts and insecurities. Memories might open a way back to the lost self, hidden by her professional persona, with its collateral brittleness and weariness. She reflected that ordinary means just normal and ordained, that even the casualness of every day is on purpose, meant to be. The net of heaven is wide. Not even the whisper of a thought slips through it. This imposes grave responsibility, and sometimes it brings hope as well. Esme began to type. She had no formed ideas as yet. She was just copying the words of the collect for the 23rd Sunday in ordinary time. O God, you bear your people ever on your heart and mind. Watch over us in your protecting love, that, strengthened by your Spirit, we may not miss your way for us. And then the phone rang. On the upper side of the telephone receiver, to catch her attention before she lifted it from its cradle, Esme had attached a sticker on which she had printed in bold letters, "Breathe, smile," and drawn a little flower. Despite this, she felt a small frown of irritation and an involuntary compression of her lips as she grabbed the thing that had scattered her train of thought and said into it crisply, "Hello? Esme Brown?" "Oh, Marcus Griffiths here." Esme recognised already the deceptively absent-minded tone of her senior steward of the chapel at Brockhurst Priory. "Oh, hello, Marcus." She tried to sound friendly and then waited while he paused. "Oh, look, am I disturbing you? I mean, you aren't here, are you, yet? Tell me if I'm intruding." "Yes, you are. Leave me alone," thought Esme, as she replied, "Of course not. It's lovely to hear from you. How can I help?" "Oh, well," he hesitated. I mean, really, feel free to say no, but really, Hilda and I thought that you might be relishing the peace, but on the other hand, you might be lonely. And if you're not relishing the peace, if you'd like to, please just say no. Would you like to pop over for supper this evening? If you'd like to. Not if you'd rather not." He sounded so thoroughly apologetic that Esme hadn't the heart to say no. She accepted his invitation, thanked him, and went back to her sermon notes, added a few observations on the lectionary readings and on what it meant to be ordinary. She made a list of appropriate hymns and then shut down her computer and abandoned her study for a hot bath. And so, for the second time that day, as the evening chill mingled with the amber of late sunshine, she found herself driving out to Wiles Green, where Marcus Griffiths, a retired bookseller, lived with his wife Hilda. Their home proved to be a comfortable family house with pleasing proportions and low ceilings, furnished with unpretentious but lovely antique furniture, fruitwood, rural craftsmanship, chosen with an unerring aesthetic eye. Armchairs and a generous sofa occupied by a truculent-looking border terrier who watched her out of one eye. The large open fireplace was filled in these days still hot at the end of the summer with an arrangement of dried grasses and seed heads. An assortment of paintings hung on the walls, striking modern oil or acrylic portraits mixed surprisingly successfully with more traditional landscapes and watercolour sketches. The ancient oak floorboards were softened with Eastern rugs whose colours glowed with the richness of silk. Taking all this in, Esme reflected that Marcus must have been a spectacularly good bookseller. A tall, thin man, with sparse hair combed back from his brow, Marcus greeted her at the door with impeccable courtesy. A vague, indefinable abstraction hung in the air about him, like the dust around an old easy-chair that has had its cushions too roughly handled. His glasses provided a dual function. They focused the acute observation of his very intelligent gaze, and they also served as a form of screen or hide for moments when he preferred to make himself absent. Esme thought he looked both perceptive and kind, which reinforced the impression she'd received their first meeting. He stood aside to allow her to enter his living room ahead of him. Drawn to the view of the garden through the French windows framed in heavy linen floral curtains at the far end of the room, Esme walked across to look out at the profusion of late summer flowers in the herbaceous borders, at the stone fountain in the lilied pond, and at the grouped shrubs, stone urns and statuary that stood here and there, dwarfed by mature and graceful trees. "Goodness me," she exclaimed. "Your garden's massive," adding quickly, "and so beautiful." Marcus wandered across the room to stand beside her. "A little overblown, perhaps, at this time of year. I enjoy it at all times, but I prefer the sculptural qualities of a winter garden. So many flowers can be a little cloying at times. Rather an excess of pink, wouldn't you say? Sherry?" As he travelled across the room to fill with a generous helping of sherry one of the heavy crystal glasses on the sideboard, Marcus bellowed, "Hilda!" in the direction of the door, and this was rewarded by a sense of energetic bustling that heralded his wife's arrival. Stout and well-made, a handsome woman, conventionally and expensively dressed, wearing no makeup, but with immaculately dressed hair. Hilda had bold, dark eyes and a determined chin that gave notice of a forceful character. "Marcus Haribis! I had no idea. Welcome, my dear, welcome. Won't you sit down? I didn't hear you come in. Are you parked outside? It's not like me to overlook a car drawing up. so glad you could come. Have you been offered? Oh, yes, good. Let me find a little mat for that glass. You do eat meat, my dear? I was most annoyed with Marcus. What if she's vegetarian? I said to him. You must check. You must always check. Times have changed. These idealistic types live on the most extraordinary things, lentils and wild rice. But he wouldn't call you back to check. He would not. Not that we eat so much meat ourselves nowadays. A little savoury pâté, a rasher of bacon, the odd chop. When the family was here, with us, it was different. Of course, it was all different then. My goodness. My brood could divulge a whole bird at one sitting. Marcus's eyes flickered momentarily as Esme registered the strangeness of this last remark. But he said merely, Do you eat meat, Esme? If not, I've no doubt we can find something else. Esme reassured them that she did eat meat, though, like most people, less now than once. And when later they sat down to dine, at an exquisite beechwood dining suite, the table laid with Georgian silver and damask napkins, the selection of vegetables grown in the garden, accompanying tender cuts of locally raised meat with delicious gravy, made her glad she'd accepted this invitation to supper. Inevitably their conversation drifted to matters connected with the chapel, and Esme discovered that in addition to Marcus's responsibility as senior steward, he and Hilda both were key members of the Finance and Property Committee. It's been a difficult year for decisions. Oh, my dear, your wine is low. Marcus, Esme's wine is low. Driving? Oh, then some tonic water. Marcus? Very difficult. It seems not 5 minutes since we were raising funds for the replacing of the windows. I won't say replacement windows, because in a conservation area, that's hardly what they are. And besides, as Marcus says, it's such a quaint idea. I mean, they are actually windows, but you know what I mean. But the thing is, now that having made good and decorated, the awkward place with the damp has caused the emotion paint to the west corner of the chapel to lift, and I really think, oh, more gravy? More carrots? More potato? Nonetheless, when Marcus comes to present the draft of the accounts, still to be audited, of course, still to be audited, but he's rarely out, in the autumn, I think you may satisfy yourself that our heads are still above the parapet. Marcus laid down his fork and waved his hand in vague demur. Water, he said. Water? My dear, you have a full glass. Esme too. I think sometimes you really should have your eyes checked again. Try the other man this time. I'm not convinced Mr. Robinson isn't becoming questionably visionary himself. Marcus glanced at his wife with a kind of wondering incredulity. Mr. Robinson is a practical man who could never have been described as visionary, questionably or otherwise. I am adequately supplied with beverages, and at Brockhurst Chapel we may be considered still to have our heads above water, though, as you say, the year ahead presents its challenges. Hilda gazed at him, baffled. Marcus, whatever are you talking about? You're simply repeating everything I've said and adding nothing to the conversation at all. And why on earth were you asking for water if you know perfectly well you've already got some? Really, you could try the patience of a saint at times. You can see my point, Esme, I'm sure. Heavens! Are we ready to move on to pudding, or is anyone still waiting for sex? Seconds, Esme? Asked Marcus with utter gravity, but a certain sardonic gleam behind the glasses and under the eyebrows lifted in inquiry. I'd like you to be clear as to what you were being offered. Potato, maybe? Or meat? No? Pudding then, Hilda, I think. Feeling most comfortably replete after an excellent meal, Esme settled herself into the cushions of an armchair as the three of them returned to the sitting room to enjoy their coffee. In their absence, the dog had moved off the sofa and now slumbered peacefully on the hearthrug, snoring slightly. For a short while, as Hilda set off purposefully to the kitchen to fetch the tray of cups, Marcus and Esme lapsed into silence, and she wondered if she should take some conversational initiative. "I've been thinking about getting a bike," she said, searching for something to talk about. "I spend so much time in the car, and the roads are so busy. Can you recommend a good place to go for a bike?" Marcus considered. "How much of a cyclist are you?" he asked at length. "Oh, well, I can manage hills and I don't fall off, but I shan't be going in for races. Just for a bit of exercise, really." "Oh, I see. Then I think Jabez Ferrell might answer your purpose. He sometimes has something to sell, and he's in any case a useful man to know. I never met anyone so resourceful. He's in Wiles Green, not far from here, 50 yards past the Bull, as you come into Wiles Green from Brockhurst Priory. Back of the old police house, where Pam Coleman lives, you'll find him. He would certainly advise you and maintain for you, regardless of what he may or may not have in." Esme fished in her bag for her diary, which experience had taught her to take with her everywhere, and in the memoranda pages at the back, she wrote down what Marcus had said. Jabez Ferrell. Peculiar, old-fashioned name, she thought. Wiles Green, behind the old police house, 50 yards beyond the pub. Bikes, she wrote above this memo, underlined. Over coffee, they chatted about Esme's manse. "Have you got all you need?" asked Marcus. Is everything as it should be?" "It's all in very good order." Esme hesitated. What she wanted to say sounded a little unappreciative. "Will you understand if I say that for me, a difficult thing to come to terms with in ministry is that I realise a manse can never quite be a home. Please don't misunderstand me. The circuit stewards have worked so hard to make it lovely. The kitchen has just been completely redone, and I have not a single grumble. It's just, well, looking round at your sitting room, I can see you are people who love your home. And part of what makes it home, I think, is that it's either the place you grew up or the place you chose because you fell in love with it. And part of what makes it lovable is its idiosyncrasies, like a person, really. But of course, the whole point about acquiring and maintaining a manse is to find a neutral kind of place, a sensible purchase with as few idiosyncrasies as possible, and iron out what ones there are before ever anybody moves in. Little things, oddities, I don't know. She was beginning to feel a bit silly and wondered if she would have been better never to begin this. Marcus and Hilda were both listening to her thoughtfully, and she could feel herself getting embarrassed and hot. Please don't think I'm complaining. The manse is really nice. There's nothing wrong with it as a manse. But, well, for example, here you have your fireplace, and it must be lovely in the winter to sit down by an open fire in the evening. But in South Harbour, of course, it's a smoke-free zone, and naturally the manse will be there because it's the biggest place in the section, the most convenient, and anyway, manses never have open fires. But I do love a fire. Do you see what I mean? I can see why they don't have one. Not everyone likes a fire. Chimneys have to be swept. Fires are hazardous, and then as well they make dust and ash and so on. I can see why manses have only central heating. Marcus just watched her, and Esme wished he wouldn't. But Hilda nodded sympathetically. I know just what you mean, dear, she said warmly. It's a blessing. Central heating is a blessing. Having the circuit stewards to sort things out leaves you free to do your wonderful work. I envy you your spanking new kitchen. Ours leaves a lot to be desired. The manse is very convenient. Everything done, all mod cons. But everything has a backside. In silence, Esme and Marcus pondered this judgment. Marcus put his coffee cup back on the tray. Downside, he murmured absently. Then he looked very hard at Esme. I know exactly what you mean, he said. You are talking about home being somewhere that somehow recognises one, a place where one truly belongs, somewhere one can in the fullest and deepest sense call one's own. Well, please make this a second home. Investigate the junk shops. Find yourself a toasting fork and keep it here. You will be welcome. He nodded slightly to give this emphasis, and Esme felt a sudden gratitude for the kindness of this couple. Thank you, she said, and thank you so much for a lovely evening. I won't make myself a nuisance, but certainly I'd love to come again. Before she knew it, the remainder of August slipped away. Esme met some other members of her congregations. One or two dropped in with flowers or cards, one with an apple pie, to welcome her. And she was introduced to more people than she could remember when she stayed for coffee after worship at Portland Street and Brockhurst Priory chapels on her remaining free Sundays. And then September came, the beginning of the Methodist year, with its flurry of committee meetings, special services, the round of preaching and visiting and leadership responsibilities, and so many things to plan and do. Esme's diary filled up until it was back to its usual level of dense notes on every page, scarcely thinning out until 2 months ahead. Her day off she guarded jealously. The rest of the time it was like a juggling act in a circus of bureaucracy. She had asked God for a friend, but right now she felt grateful she didn't have any within easy reach of her. Friends are a time-consuming luxury in a minister's life. Any thoughts of exercise or cycling or walking in the country were shelved for the time being. She might well get to that, but for now it would have to wait. She knew that in due course patterns would establish and familiarity would give space in the work. Beginnings are always hectic. She worried sometimes that all her energies could be absorbed by the bigger congregation at Portland Street, leaving Brockhurst Priory a poor second, and Wiles Green to fend for themselves, which is what they were used to. As she went to bed at night, in the brief time before she fell asleep, exhausted, Esme whispered to herself, "Don't panic, Es," and felt guilty that she was too tired to pray. And it's part 4 next time, which will be the beginning of chapter 2. I hope my mind doesn't get too confused with the numbers. I find it quite hard to take things in. Wow, gosh. Do you know, I recorded that about 5 times. There was one recording where I got about 20 minutes in and then it just blanked out on my phone and I had to move across to the computer instead and record on here. And I had to go downstairs and get myself 2 marshmallows to get a sugar hit to my brain to have another go. But anyway, here we are. We did it in the end. Hello, how are you? I hope things are all right in your world. I hope this is a good day. I hope you're enjoying this story. I do recognise it's a slow-moving story and a bit of a slow beginning. I hope it's all right for you. It gets very, very varying reviews on Amazon, this story. Well, you haven't got to listen to it, have you, if you're one of the people that finds it tedious? You could always check out Dan Brown or something instead. Let's have a prayer. Oh, Heavenly Father, the great I am, the ground of our being, the mystery from which we come, that wraps around us all our lives. Help us to find our security in you. In changing times, when we see how fragile are all the houses of cards that we build, the strategies, the plans, the things we try to put in place to make life safe. So fragile. Help us to entrust our vulnerability into your loving care. Help us to put our hand in your hand and, oh Father, hold our hands in such a way that we can feel you. Make us sensitive to your presence. Help us to travel with you through the road of life. O God of love, may our being rest in yours. May our security be rooted and planted and grafted into your love and your grace, the provision of your kindness. In Jesus' name, Amen. Well, now this video is unconscionably long. I better stop it. But I hope you have a very good rest of your day. Nice to see you, chum.